20,000 fans packed into Madison Square Garden, the most famous arena in the world, on a warm night in August of 1991. There was a wedding, an actual wedding, white dress and flowers and vows, billed to the audience as the match made in heaven. There was a main event dripping in red, white, and blue, the ultimate American hero, standing tall against a man who had turned his back on his country. There was a young challenger who would walk out of that building, reborn as a superstar. Confetti, rice, cheers loud enough to shake the rafters, a genuine fairy tale. But underneath all of it, behind that heavy velvet curtain, something was rotting. Because on that very same night, in that very same building, one of the most powerful men in all of entertainment was being held hostage. Not with a weapon, with leverage. A performer had backed him into a corner and demanded a small fortune in cash, delivered before the show where the entire event would collapse in front of a sold-out crowd. And that promoter, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands, and playing the gracious host, had already made a cold decision. The moment this man walked back through the curtain, his career would be over, finished, executed. And that is only one of the secrets buried inside this show. Because on that same card, another man was wrestling on a body that was quite literally breaking apart, an injury so severe that doctors weren't sure he would ever compete again. And hanging over the entire company, over every single muscle-bound hero the fans screamed for that night, was a federal investigation that was closing in fast. An investigation that would soon threaten to bring the whole empire crashing down. This is the dark truth behind SummerSlam 1991. By the time we reach the end, you will never look at that fairy tale the same way again. But to understand just how dark this night truly was, you first have to understand what the fans in the seats believed they were watching. Because the illusion was beautiful, it really was. The tagline said it all. A match made in heaven, a match made in hell. On the heaven side, you had the wedding of the decade, Randy Savage, the Macho King, and the woman he loved, Miss Elizabeth. This was a real emotional payoff for millions of people who had followed their on-screen romance for years, watched them split apart, watched Elizabeth run to the ring to save Savage from a beating just months earlier at WrestleMania. Now they were getting married in the middle of Madison Square Garden, and grown adults were tearing up in the stands. It felt earned, it felt genuine. It felt like a happy ending. On the hell side, you had the main event. Hulk Hogan, the flag-waving embodiment of American patriotism, teaming with the Ultimate Warrior, the most explosive, most electrifying force the company had. The two biggest, most colorful heroes in the world, standing side by side, and across the ring from them, a trio of villains built specifically to make your blood boil. Sergeant Slaughter, once a beloved American drill sergeant, now a traitor who had pledged loyalty to a foreign enemy during a real war. Alongside him, General Adnan and Colonel Mustafa, the man fans had known for years as the Iron Sheik, good versus evil. It was about as simple and as loud as wrestling got, and in the middle of the card, almost quietly, a coronation. A young man named Bret Hart, who had spent years as one half of a tag team, stepped into the ring against the arrogant, brilliant Intercontinental Champion known as Mr. Perfect. And in front of his own parents, seated at ringside, Bret Hart made the man they called Perfect submit and walked out with the first singles championship of his career. It was the night everyone realized Bret Hart was going to be a major star. There was more. The Legion of Doom, those apocalyptic road warriors, captured the tag team titles. Virgil, the long-suffering manservant of the $1 Million Man, finally got his revenge and took the $1 Million belt from his tormentor. The Big Boss Man threw the Mountie in a literal jail. It was a stacked show, a memorable show, the kind of night that fans would talk about for decades. That was the surface, that was the postcard, and it was gorgeous. Now let's talk about what was actually happening behind it. To understand the ransom, you have to go back more than a year, to the spring of 1990, and to a decision that Vince McMahon would come to regret more than almost any other. At WrestleMania 6, in front of a packed Toronto Sky Dome, the Ultimate Warrior did the unthinkable. He pinned Hulk Hogan clean in the middle of the ring and walked out as the World Wrestling Federation champion. It was supposed to be a passing of the torch. Hogan had carried the company on his back for the better part of a decade, and the idea was that Warrior, younger, more explosive, with that face paint and that manic energy and those tassels, would be the man to carry it into the future. It did not go the way anybody planned. Warrior was a phenomenon in the ring for a few electric minutes, but he was not Hogan. He He didn't have Hogan's ease on the microphone, Hogan's reliability, Hogan's instinct for connecting with a live crowd night after night after night. Business dipped during his title reign. The house show numbers, the money the company made from live events across the country started to soften. Arenas that had been packed to the rafters for Hogan were now showing empty seats. And in the wrestling business, empty seats are the only language that truly matters. It did not matter how loud the pop was when Warrior sprinted to the ring. It did not matter how many kids wore the face paint to school. If the buildings were not full, the experiment was failing, and McMahon knew it. He had bet the future of his company on the wrong horse, and now he had to find a way to unwind that bet without admitting he had made a mistake. So McMahon, who had built an empire on Hulk Hogan, began to quietly plan a course correction. So in January of 1991 at the Royal Rumble, the Ultimate Warrior lost the championship, and he didn't lose it back to Hogan. He lost it to Sergeant Slaughter, the Iraqi sympathizer, in a match where the Macho King Randy Savage interfered and cost Warrior the title. The whole thing was a setup, a piece of storytelling engineering designed to move the belt onto a hated villain so that Hulk Hogan could ride to the rescue and win it back at WrestleMania 7, reclaiming his spot at the top of the mountain. And that is exactly what happened. Hogan beat Slaughter, Hogan got his belt back, Hogan was the man again. But the Ultimate Warrior was left standing off to the side watching, and he started doing some math. And he looked at the checks. He looked at what he was being paid versus what Hulk Hogan was being paid. And in his mind, the numbers did not add up. He believed he was every bit the draw Hogan was. He had beaten Hogan clean at the biggest show of the year, and yet, when the payoffs came in, there was a gap, a significant one. By Warrior's own account, he believed the difference between his check and Hogan's check for WrestleMania 7 was somewhere in the neighborhood of $500,000. That resentment festered all summer long. It grew. And here's where a story that most fans remember as a simple, spontaneous act of greed becomes something more complicated. Because the Ultimate Warrior did not just ambush Vince McMahon out of nowhere on the day of the show. Over the course of that summer, the two men exchanged a series of letters. Warrior laid out his case. He wanted what he called parity with Hulk Hogan, not more than Hogan, the same as Hogan, the same cut of the pay-per-view money, the same percentage of merchandise sales, the same kind of guarantees on live event payoffs. In his mind, if he was co-headlining the biggest shows on the planet, he should be compensated like the other man co-headlining those shows. On the 10th of July, 1991, the conflict came to a head. Warrior sent McMahon a handwritten letter, a document that has since been made public in various forms over the years. The handwriting was raw, the tone was blunt, but the message was unmistakable. He demanded the same pay structure as Hogan across the board. He put a specific number on the WrestleMania 7 discrepancy, requesting that roughly $550,000 be made right. And then came the part that changed everything. Warrior told McMahon in writing that he had been patient long enough and that he would not appear at the Meadowlands or at any other arena until his terms were met. He had drawn a line, and he had done it in ink weeks before the shows. Now, in the culture of professional wrestling, there is an unwritten code, and that code says that you do not hold up a promoter. You do not use the show itself as a weapon. You handle your business, you fight for your money, but you do not put a gun to the boss's head with the fans already in their seats. It was, and still is, considered one of the cardinal sins of the entire industry. And the Ultimate Warrior was about to commit it on the grandest stage there was. Vince McMahon, for his part, did what Vince McMahon has always done best. He negotiated, he stalled, he played the role of the concerned father figure, the mentor who only wanted what was best for his boy. He assured Warrior that they could work this out, that there was no need for threats, that they were family. But as the calendar pages turned and SummerSlam drew closer, Warrior began to understand what working it out actually meant. It meant delay, it meant promises that dissolved the moment they were made, It meant that the check was always in the mail, and the mail never came. So the Ultimate Warrior made a decision. He decided to use the only real leverage he had ever been handed: his body, his face paint, and his advertised presence in the main event of a sold-out show at Madison Square Garden, which brings us to the day itself, the 26th of August, 1991. The production trucks rolled up to the Garden, the talent filed in, the ring was assembled, the lights were hung, the pay-per-view feed was checked and rechecked, the arena would be full, every seat sold, and somewhere in the back, the Ultimate Warrior delivered his ultimatum, face-to-face this time, no more letters. According to the accounts of the people who were there, including McMahon himself, including the agent Bruce Pritchard, including Sergeant Slaughter, the message was simple and it was final. Warrior would not go to the ring unless the money was in hand. He wanted a lump sum to cover the perceived shortfall from WrestleMania, and he wanted guarantees about his contract going forward. Pay me or I do not perform. And the clock was ticking down towards showtime. And this was not a bluff that McMahon could easily call, because the Ultimate Warrior had chosen his moment with surgical precision. He had not made his stand at some forgotten house show in a half-empty arena in the middle of nowhere. He had made it at Madison Square Garden on pay-per-view with the whole industry watching in the main event of the single biggest summer show the company produced. There was no understudy who could paint their face and run to the ring in his place. There was no way to quietly rewrite the finish and hope nobody noticed. Warrior was advertised, Warrior was expected, and Warrior knew that his absence would leave a hole in the show that nothing could fill. He had spent years feeling like the company held all the cards. Now, for one night, for a few short hours, he held them all, and he intended to cash them in. Think about the position that put McMahon in. If the Ultimate Warrior no-showed the main event, if that famous entrance music hit and nobody came sprinting down the aisle, the consequences would have been catastrophic. This was Madison Square Garden, the company's spiritual home, the building where the whole empire had been born. 20,000 people were expecting the match they had paid for. Hundreds of thousands more were watching live on pay-per-view, having handed over their money for the same reason. Failing to deliver the advertised main event in that building, on that stage, could have meant riots in the seats, lawsuits from broadcasters, a fracture in the trust between the company and its audience that might never have healed. And so, according to every version of this story, some of the boys in the back wanted to solve the problem the way wrestlers had solved problems for 100 years. Hogan and Slaughter, the story goes, wanted to deal with Warrior the old-fashioned way. Not with a check, with their hands. There were men in that locker room fully prepared to walk into Warrior's dressing room and settle the matter physically to make him go to the ring one way or another. But Vince McMahon did not want to brawl in the back on the night of his biggest summer show. He wanted the event to happen clean on television, exactly as advertised. So he swallowed his pride. He swallowed all of it. He agreed to Warrior's terms. He arranged for the money. He verbally agreed to the contract demands. He looked the Ultimate Warrior in the eye and he shook his hand. And in that handshake, Warrior believed he had won. He believed he had finally forced the most powerful man in wrestling to treat him as an equal. He went back to his dressing room. He laced up his boots, he painted his face, those signature streaks of color, and he prepared to go out and give the fans everything he had. He had no idea he was walking into a trap, because Vince McMahon had already decided how this story was going to end. And he later admitted, in no uncertain terms, that he agreed to the demand, knowing exactly what he was going to do. The second Warrior stepped out of that ring. He said it gave him great pleasure to do it. The match itself was a spectacle, and to the untrained eye, everything was perfect. Hogan and Warrior, the two biggest heroes in the world, side by side against the villains. Sid Justice, a massive, imposing figure, stood as the special guest referee, a role that carried its own quiet menace, because everyone sensed Sid was a wild card who might turn on the heroes at any moment. The crowd was deafening. Warrior sprinted to the ring the way he always did, shaking the ropes, snorting, radiating that untamed energy that made him a star in the first place. Nobody in those 20,000 seats had the faintest idea that the man they were cheering had spent the last few hours holding the entire show hostage. The heroes won, of course. Hogan pinned Sergeant Slaughter and the good guys stood tall. And here is a detail that tells you everything, a detail that observers only truly understood in hindsight. When the match ended, Hogan stayed in the ring. He posed, he soaked up the adulation. He did what Hogan did, milking every ounce of the moment for the crowd. But the Ultimate Warrior did not linger. He did not celebrate with his partner. He barely acknowledged Hogan at all. Instead, he turned and ran up the aisle toward the back, disappearing through the curtain. To the fans, it looked completely normal. The Warrior always ran. Running was part of his whole persona. But he was not running in celebration. He was running straight toward his own execution because Vince McMahon was waiting for him on the other side of that curtain, and McMahon did not scream, he did not throw a punch, he did not make a scene. He simply stepped into the aisle and he handed the Ultimate Warrior a letter dated that very day, a letter that laid out in cold and careful language everything that had happened. It acknowledged that McMahon had agreed to Warrior's financial demands, but it made clear that he had done so only under duress, only to make sure the show went on for the fans who had paid to see it. It stated that because Warrior had threatened to breach his contract, because he had effectively held the company for ransom, he was being suspended, effective immediately. In practice, it was a termination. It was the end. The wrestler Jake Roberts, the Snake, was standing right there. He saw the whole thing. He would tell the story many times over the years, and his version never wavered. As Warrior came through the curtain, McMahon stepped out into the middle of the aisle and told him he was fired. That was it. 3 words, and a career at its absolute peak was over. And what did the Ultimate Warrior do? According to Roberts, he just kept walking. He didn't stop, he didn't argue, he didn't beg. He read the situation, absorbed the blow, and kept moving. Roberts said he could not believe what he had just witnessed. And McMahon, turning to Roberts in that moment, reportedly looked at the Snake and told him that he had the worst luck of anyone he knew. The most electrifying man in sports entertainment had been erased from the company in the span of a single handshake and a single letter. He had gotten his money, and he had lost everything else. But as brutal as that betrayal was, and it was brutal, it was only the beginning of what the company did next. Because Vince McMahon did not just fire the Ultimate Warrior, he set out to bury him. In the days and weeks that followed, the World Wrestling Federation went on the offensive in a way it almost never did with its own internal disputes. On television, they told the fans a clean and simple version of events. The Ultimate Warrior had been suspended for unprofessional conduct. That was the story. No mention of letters, no mention of $500,000, no mention of a handshake in the back at Madison Square Garden. Just a vague, damning phrase designed to paint one man as the problem. Behind the scenes, McMahon felt personally betrayed, and he was not a man who forgave betrayal easily. In his own telling, he had taken a bodybuilder with limited wrestling ability and transformed him into a global icon. He had given him the crown jewel, a clean victory over Hulk Hogan himself, a gift he handed out to almost no one. And in return, this man had put a gun to his head hours before the biggest show of the summer. To McMahon, there was no greater sin, and he would make Warrior pay for it for years. The Ultimate Warrior retreated to his home out west. He kept the money he had been paid, and whether he had any legal right to keep it became a subject of debate that dragged on for a long time. He tried to build his own ventures, a wrestling school, other projects. But without the machine behind him, without the cameras and the pyro and the storylines that had made him a household name, his relevance drained away with shocking speed. The character had been enormous. The man behind it, standing alone, could not sustain it. And there's a bitter irony buried in that. The very thing that had given the Ultimate Warrior his leverage, the fact that he was a top draw the company could not easily replace, evaporated the moment he was no longer standing under those lights with that music playing. Warrior, the icon, could hold Vince McMahon hostage for an evening. Warrior, the man alone at home in the desert, could hold no one hostage at all. The power had never really belonged to him. It had belonged to the machine, and the machine had simply decided to switch him off. He had won the battle in the hallway at Madison Square Garden, and in doing so, he had lost the only war that mattered. And that would have been a dark enough story on its own. A career killed by ego on both sides, a fortune won and a future lost. A bridge burned so completely that the ashes are still visible 3 decades later. But the ransom and the firing are only one thread in the darkness of that night. Pull on another one and it gets worse. Because standing in that ring in the main event wearing the colors of a foreign enemy during an actual war was a man whose family was living in genuine fear. Sergeant Slaughter was not always a villain. For years, he had been one of the most beloved figures in the entire business, a tough-as-nails American drill sergeant, a character so patriotic that he had a cartoon and an action figure and a spot in the hearts of kids all across the country. But in late 1990, the company made a decision that, by any modern standard, is almost impossible to imagine. They turned Sergeant Slaughter heel, and they did not just make him a bad guy, they made him an Iraqi sympathizer, a man who had turned his back on America and pledged his allegiance to the enemy. The idea was to generate heat, real, white-hot, dangerous heat, and it worked far better than anyone could have predicted. Slaughter would go on television and claim he had burned the flag, though he later clarified that he had refused to actually do that and had instead burned a Hulk Hogan shirt fashioned to look like one. He praised a foreign dictator, he denounced his own country as soft and weak, and the fans did not respond to it the way they responded to a normal wrestling villain. They responded to it the way you respond to a genuine traitor. The night Slaughter won the championship from the Ultimate Warrior at the Royal Rumble, things started to come apart in the real world. According to Slaughter's own recollection, a veteran backstage figure pulled him aside and asked him if he had spoken to his wife that day, if he had spoken to Vince. Slaughter had not. He was told to make the calls, and when he did, he learned that the heat he was generating on television had followed him home. His family was receiving death threats, real ones, threats serious enough that they could not be ignored, could not be laughed off as the ranting of angry fans. This is the part that gets lost when people look back on that era with a smile. The heat was not a game. In a country where families had sons and husbands and daughters actually deployed to a war zone, the sight of a man in a military uniform praising the enemy did not read as harmless entertainment. To some people, it read as an insult to the people they loved, and a small number of those people were angry enough and unstable enough to make genuine threats. Slaughter had agreed to the role because he trusted the company and believed in the business, and by his own account, his wife had been against it from the start. She had been right to be worried. The man went to work every night to be hated on purpose, and then he went home to a family that had to wonder whether the hatred would follow him through the front door. It got worse. When WrestleMania 7 rolled around that spring, the show was originally meant to be held in a massive outdoor stadium, the Los Angeles Coliseum, a venue that could hold 70,000 people. Instead, at the last minute, it was moved to a much smaller indoor arena next door. The company's official explanation was security. They cited bomb threats connected to Slaughter's character, the fear that someone might actually try to hurt people at an event headlined by a man playing an enemy of the state during wartime. Some observers argued the real reason was that the company simply hadn't sold enough tickets to fill a stadium, and that the security explanation was a convenient cover. But whatever the truth of the venue change, the death threats against Slaughter and his family were not manufactured. Those were real. A man had agreed to play a character, and in return, his wife and children had to live in fear. There's even a story that the writing team briefly considered having Slaughter burn a real flag in the ring during his heel run to push the heat to its absolute limit. Slaughter himself reportedly shot the idea down. He understood in a way the writers apparently did not, that doing something like that in a live arena in that climate could have gotten people seriously hurt, himself included. And SummerSlam 1991 was the last night of it. That main event was the final chapter of the Iraqi sympathizer angle, the closing of a storyline that had exploited a real war for real profit and had put a real family in real danger. After that night, Slaughter would begin his long road back to being an American hero again. But he had paid a price for that heat that no paycheck could ever fully cover. He had spent months as one of the most hated men in the country, a hatred that had reached past the character and put its hands around the throat of his actual life. That is two threads now, the ransom and the firing, the war and the death threats, and we are still not at the bottom of it because there is a shadow that hangs over every single image from that night. over every rippling muscle and every heroic pose, over the whole gleaming, larger-than-life spectacle of it. And that shadow is chemical. And to understand it, you have to look at what was happening in a courtroom that very summer, far away from the bright lights of Madison Square Garden. For years, the World Wrestling Federation had used a ringside physician, a urologist from Pennsylvania named George Zahorian. And Dr. Zahorian did more than treat injuries. He supplied wrestlers with anabolic steroids. For much of the 1980s, this had operated in a gray area, but the laws had tightened. The distribution of these drugs had been criminalized, and federal investigators had gotten involved. Zahorian was indicted in early 1991, and in the summer of that year, just weeks before SummerSlam, he went on trial, and he was convicted of illegally distributing steroids to professional wrestlers, dozens of them. And in the testimony, in the documents, in the paper trail that came out of that case, the shipments led directly to the company. They led to the office in Connecticut. They led eventually toward Vince McMahon himself. Now look back at that SummerSlam card with that knowledge. Look at those bodies. The sport of that era was built on size, on mass, on men who looked like they had been carved out of granite. That look was the product, and a great deal of it, by the estimates of people who were there, was chemically assisted. Some accounts from that world suggested that the overwhelming majority of the roster was using something, and the man who had been convicted of supplying a huge share of it had just walked out of a federal courtroom, a guilty man. Weeks before, these same performers went out to headline the biggest party of the summer. There's a haunting detail in how that investigation began. In the office, he was reportedly caught trying to feed his records into a paper shredder, jamming invoices and shipping documents into the machine as fast as he could. That is the image to hold in your mind when you watch the SummerSlam main event. Somewhere behind all the pyro and the patriotism and the flexing, there were real paper trails and real prosecutors and a real machine grinding paper into confetti, trying to make a secret disappear. The confetti that fell in Madison Square Garden that night was for the fans. The confetti in that doctor's office was a man trying to save himself, and by extension, trying to keep the whole house of cards from tumbling down. The company knew the walls were closing in. That very year, in an attempt to get ahead of the scandal, the World Wrestling Federation announced its first real drug testing policy, and McMahon began appearing on national television, on talk shows, defending his company, insisting the problem was a problem for all of society and not just for wrestling, but the reckoning was already coming. Within a couple of years, McMahon himself would be indicted by the federal government, accused of conspiring to distribute steroids to his own wrestlers. He would stand trial in 1994, fighting for his freedom, facing the possibility of prison. He was ultimately acquitted. But the fear, the paranoia, the sense that the whole empire could vanish overnight, that was already in the air in August of 1991. Every hero the fans cheered that night was standing on a foundation that the government was actively trying to dig out from under them. So the muscles were real in the sense that the men had earned them with brutal work. But the spectacle itself, the whole aesthetic of that era, was tangled up in something the company was desperate to hide. The dark truth of SummerSlam 1991 is not only about the men who were fired or threatened, it is about the secret that every single person in that locker room was carrying out to the ring with them in the storm that secret was about to unleash. And then there is the fourth thread, the quietest one, the one that hurts in a different way. Remember that coronation in the middle of the card? Bret Hart becoming a single star, making Mr. Perfect submit in front of his parents, walking out with the Intercontinental Championship. It is remembered as one of the finest matches of the entire era, a genuine classic, the night Bret Hart's future opened up in front of him. But almost nobody watching that night knew the truth about the man on the other side of the ring. Mr. Perfect, whose real name was Curt Hennig, was one of the most gifted athletes the business had ever produced. He moved like water. Everything he did looked effortless, crisp, flawless, which is exactly why the character worked. But months earlier, during a house show match against the British Bulldog, something had gone wrong. The turnbuckles reportedly weren't lined up properly, and Hennig was thrown into them hard, and the damage was severe. A broken tailbone, bulged discs in his back. The kind of injury where the doctors genuinely were not sure whether he would ever be able to wrestle again. He had spent that entire summer barely able to move. Some accounts say he did almost nothing but fish, trying to let his back heal, because casting a line from a quiet boat was about the only physical activity his ruined spine could tolerate. He was in constant pain. This was a man who, at his best, could take a bump so smoothly that it looked like art, who could throw himself across a ring with the grace of a diver. And now his own body had become the enemy. Every movement was a negotiation with the injury. Every day was a question of whether he would ever be the performer he had been. He was, by any reasonable measure, in no condition to have a wrestling match, let alone a long, physically demanding classic against one of the best in the world. He asked if there was a way to simply hand the title over on television, to forfeit it, to avoid the punishment his body could not absorb, and that request was not welcomed. So instead, Curt Hennig, with a broken tailbone and bulged discs, walked out to the middle of Madison Square Garden and wrestled the longest, most grueling match on the entire card. He bumped, he sold, he took the punishment. He made Bret Hart look like $1 million, and he did it because he respected Bret, because he wanted to give him the best possible night, and because that was the kind of professional he was. And it cost him. That match was his last for over a year. His body simply gave out afterward. When he finally returned to television months later, it was not as a wrestler, it was as a manager, an advisor, standing in the corner of Ric Flair, because his back could no longer be trusted to survive a real match. One of the most naturally talented performers of his generation had part of his prime taken from him, and the beautiful celebrated match that launched Bret Hart's career was for the man who made it possible, an act of enormous physical sacrifice that the roaring crowd never even suspected. So put it all together. The night that fans remember as a fairy tale was, behind the curtain, a night of ransom and betrayal, of death threats and exploited war, of a chemical secret and a looming federal storm, of a broken body dragging itself out to bleed for someone else's future. 4 dark threads all woven into one glittering sold-out show. The postcard was gorgeous. The reality underneath it was something else entirely. But there is one more chapter to this story, and it is the one that gives everything that came before it a strange and heartbreaking weight. Because the story of the Ultimate Warrior did not end at that curtain in 1991. The pull of money and nostalgia eventually brought the two enemies back together, at least for a while. In 1992, with Hulk Hogan stepping away amid the growing steroid scandal, the company needed a hero, and McMahon swallowed his grudge and reached out. Warrior returned at WrestleMania 8, storming down the aisle to save Hogan from an ambush, the crowd exploding for a man they thought they would never see again. But the reconciliation was fragile, built on need rather than trust, and it did not last. By the end of that same year, Warrior was gone once more, the company citing a failed drug test, Warrior insisting it was political. Whatever the truth, the wound from 1991 had never really healed. The two men simply could not trust each other, and everyone knew it. Years later, the company twisted the knife one final time. In 2005, they released a home video with a title that told you everything about its intent. It was called The Self-Destruction of the Ultimate Warrior. It was not a celebration, it was a demolition. Wrestler after wrestler, agent after agent, McMahon himself, all lined up to mock the man, to tear down his ability, his promos, his sanity, and to frame the SummerSlam holdup as proof that he had always been greedy, unstable, impossible. Warrior, who had refused to take part, sued the company for defamation, and the case was eventually settled. But for a whole new generation of fans, that video became the official story, the final word, the version of the Ultimate Warrior that stuck. And then, against all odds, came peace. It took another decade, and it took a different generation of leadership inside the company reaching out, but eventually the hatchet was buried. In 2014, the Ultimate Warrior came home. He sat down with Vince McMahon, and the two men, older now, embraced. McMahon apologized for the hit piece. Warrior apologized for the headaches he had caused. They agreed to leave the past where it belonged. And on the 5th of April, 2014, the Ultimate Warrior was inducted into the Hall of Fame, welcomed back into the family that had spent years trying to erase him. 2 nights later, he appeared on live television one final time. He stood in the middle of the ring in a mask and a coat, and he gave a haunting speech, a speech about legacy, about how the spirit of a man lives on long after his body is gone, about how the fans would keep his memory running forever. It felt, to everyone who heard it, strangely final, almost like a goodbye. The very next day, on the 8th of April, 2014, less than 24 hours after that speech, the Ultimate Warrior collapsed outside a hotel and died of a massive heart attack. He was 54 years old, he had made his peace, told the world his final truth, and slipped away as though he had been holding on just long enough to close the circle that began in so many ways on that night at Madison Square Garden in 1991. And that is the strange, sad power of this story. SummerSlam 1991 was sold as the biggest party of the summer, a wedding and a war and a coronation, all wrapped in confetti. But it was also the night a career was executed behind a curtain, the last night of a gimmick that terrorized a real family, a snapshot of an era standing on a chemical fault line, and a stage for a broken man to sacrifice his body for someone else's glory. Every one of those men paid a price that the cheering crowd never saw. Some paid with their careers, some paid with their peace of mind, some, in the fullness of time, paid with far more than that. The fairy tale was real in the sense that the fans felt every bit of the joy it was designed to give them. The cheers were real, the celebration was real. For those 20,000 people inside Madison Square Garden, SummerSlam 1991 looked like everything professional wrestling was supposed to be. Heroes winning, villains falling, a wedding in the ring, and a perfect ending under the brightest lights in the business. But the truth underneath it was darker, more human, and far more tragic than anyone in those seats could have imagined. Behind the curtain were arguments over money, careers hanging in the balance, bodies beginning to break down, and men discovering that being one of the biggest stars in wrestling did not make you untouchable. The velvet curtain did not just hide a backstage area, it hid an entire hidden world of leverage and fear, secrets and pain, loyalty and resentment, and it hid it beautifully, because hiding it beautifully was the entire point. No matter what was happening behind the scenes, the music still had to play, the lights still had to shine, and the audience still had to believe. That is the dark truth behind SummerSlam 1991. Not a single scandal, but a whole night of them stacked one on top of another and buried beneath one of the brightest spectacles the World Wrestling Federation had ever created. A night where the men who seemed the most invincible were, in reality, often the most vulnerable of all. From the cheap seats, it looked like a perfect ending. Behind the curtain, it was the beginning of the end for more than one of the people we watched. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of professional wrestling, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the stories they never wanted you to hear. Until next time.